So welcome to the Volunteer Tutor and Classroom Aide webinar series. This is the second Tuesday of every month at 9:30 a.m. I will let you know next month, June, will be our last webinar of this series. We will not be doing this again next program year. We're working on developing some other resources for volunteer tutors and classroom aides. And Angela, if you'll just go to the next slide. So I'm going to put a link in the chat for the survey that you can complete when you are finished, after today's webinar. And if you want to view the recordings for any of the webinars in this series, there's a link for that as well. Next month will be our last webinar in the series, and that will be about exploring pronunciation, best practices, and tools with Sarah Cole. So that will be Tuesday, June 13 at 9:30 a.m. Angela, if you want to go to the next slide, please. Today we have Angela Kennis presenting on student goals and assessment. So welcome, Angela. And I will be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions for Angela, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll let her know that you have questions. Right. Take it away.
All righty. All right, everyone. Hello. Thank you for coming to this session. I'm hoping that it's something you'll find interesting and with some useful information that you'll be able to take back with your students. The focus of today's session is really to talk a little bit about test taking strategies and students' goals and that relationship between goals and assessments. So what I'm going to be talking about today, and I do apologize, it's going to be a lot of my talkings, but I do encourage you, if you have any questions, any thing that you would like to add to my presentation, you are more than welcome to do so. Please just type in the chat. You're welcome to unmute yourself as well. Whichever way you would want to communicate with me is fine. Just to tell you a little bit about what I'm going to be talking about, I want to talk a little bit about the connection between student goals and assessments, and trying to really make that connection clear and why assessments do play an important role towards students' goals. Also, I want to talk a little bit about test anxiety and ways and strategies that you can help students to understand test anxiety and some suggestions for overcoming it. I'm also going to give some general test taking tips that your students may find helpful. I'm also going to talk about some suggestions for different types of tests. I know that for us, many of us use are either the TABE or the CASAS testing. However, students are faced with many different types of tests, both summative and formative, and they come in different types outside of just, of course, multiple choice, which I will be talking about, but also helping students to realize that they may encounter some other types of test taking questions. I wanted to give some suggestions for those as well. So we'll be looking at, in addition to the multiple choice test questions, I'm going to talk a little bit about true and false testing. We'll talk a little bit about matching tests, short answer, essay, and then the importance of assessing errors once they've completed some form of assessment. And then, of course, I'll hopefully have some time for questions. To any questions you may have about the information that I present. I did want to let you know that everything that I'm presenting in terms of the test taking strategies are all research based. They are things that have been shown to be helpful. And I have used these strategies with my students in many of my classes over the years, because of course, in my classes, I do, when students do sections, when we review sections, for example, for classroom aides, when you're maybe working with a student who's working on their math their social studies, GED, for example. They may have matching tests with vocabulary. So I have used all of this information at one point or another with students. So I wanted to let you know these are suggestions, tried and true, that I have used over the years. So, all right, I want to talk first about student goals and assessments, and really what is the connection? So, I want you to take a moment to think about the reasons why students come to our classrooms and why they want our services. So you're welcome to put your responses in the chat, or you can unmute yourself to share the reasons. Why do students come to your classes?
So Angela, we have a couple people in the chat. Sumalata says to develop their skills, and Cindy says to get a better job. Lynn says get a high school diploma. And Katie says improve English language skills. And Cindy also says improve reading for functional daily tasks.
All right. Yes, all of you provide some wonderful reasons as to why students come to our classes, and I just included the list here, but many of these things you have already listed. You know, they want to build their reading, writing, speaking, and listening skills. They want to improve overall communication. We had mentioned work. Some of them want to go on to some form of post-secondary education and training. For some, it's to understand American culture, and then for others, perhaps to connect with other English language learners. So there are many reasons why students come to our classes, but really it's the focus, and what I wanted to talk about is what's that connection between these reasons and for attending and their goals. And really, the people attend our goals. I'm sorry, people attend our classes because we. Oh, back. I'm sorry. Sorry. So people are attending our classes because we can help them meet a goal, and it's that goal that's the underlying reason. So sometimes people will say that they come to our classes because they want to improve their English skills, but that is just perhaps the tip of the iceberg. It's only part of the reason. You know, they may want to improve those skills because they know if they do, they could find a better job. Or you have an HSE student that says their goal is to get the GED, but it's not so much to get the GED, it's because they need that GED because they want to attend a post-secondary program and it's needed. And so it's the underlying reasons that represents the students' goals for attending the program. So I think that's kind of the point that I really wanted to make, is that sometimes there's always something deeper. For GED students, I've always said, nobody wakes up one morning and says, oh, I want my GED. They want what that credential represents. And so helping to focus on what the credential represents helps them to stay engaged and focused in our services. So I am a firm believer of that. So what does that have to do then with testing? So if we look at what motivates students to come and stay with us, the real connection then between the goals and the testing is that there's generally some type of assessment that's going to be tied to that particular goal. For example, some students may need to take some type of employment test for an entry-level position in certain occupations. many post-secondary institutions will require some type of assessment for acceptance into a program. So for example, students that wish to access some form of funding from our local career link, they need to take some type of assessment. And so at our career link, they're required to take the cost assessment and score at a certain level in order to be eligible to access funding to go on to school. You know, some different places have employment tests. I know that many customer service related types of jobs have an assessment that they have you take prior to even being called for an interview. So if the goal is a job, helping them to prepare for assessments, or their goal is to go on to school, helping them to prepare for what may be coming down the line for them, does involve addressing some type of test taking skills. So then, given the important role that the testing has for students to meet those goals, preparing them for the realities of the different types of assessments can be very beneficial to them. So now that we've talked about the connection between student goals and assessment, we can talk about some strategies that you can share with students to help them improve their overall assessment skills. Did anybody, I'd love to hear any feedback that anybody has regarding the tie between assessments and student goals. Would you agree that most of your students have some type of underlying reason that they're coming, other than just like wanting to get a GED or wanting to learn English, that there's something generally beyond that that's motivating them? You can unmute yourself or type something in the chat.
A lot of students come because just they want to prove they can do it to themselves and to their kids. And I think that's a huge motivator.
And assessments are needed to, you know, so many students get nervous about assessments, but they really are needed so that you can see what type of progress that you're making. So many students don't realize how much they've improved from when they started till the time of taking some type of assessment. So it's helpful to have that. We're going to go ahead.
Oh, something just showed up in the chat here.
Okay.
Says assessments are helpful to determine the level of the students.
Yes, you kind of need to know where they're starting at in order to be able to plan for instruction, plan what you want to do with them. It really is, it's something that's so necessary. All right. So now that we've talked about that, I want to talk a little bit about test anxiety. Whatever student.
Angela,
Yes.
I just had a student, and she came and told me she wanted to better her English, and I said fine, and we worked at it, and she did progress. But the interesting part was she came one day and she said she wanted to become a citizen, and I said okay. And so I happened to have some material, the 100 questions that they get when they go for citizenship. And she passed it with flying colors, as I understand. And then she promptly stopped coming. She said she was, well, she did have many responsibilities at home with children and her mother-in-law. And so I understood that. But then I felt really bad that she got her citizenship thing and then she quit. So I had to say it wasn't because, it was because of her circumstances. But I didn't realize that was her underlying wish, to become a
Right.
citizen.
And when you understand what that underlying wish, you helped her achieve her goal. It's just you helped her meet that underlying goal. And then of course, as adults and with our students, as happens so often, life happens, and so they stop out. But to be honest with you, do not be surprised if a little bit later down the line she would happen to return. It is not uncommon for students to return because she met her one goal, but then goals change and you set new goals, and she helped you you helped her experience success with one of her goals. So if she gets another underlying goal at some point in time, I wouldn't be surprised if she returns, because she knows that she was able to find somebody who was successful in helping her to achieve it. But yeah, it always you feel bad when they stop out, but it is just a reality of adult ed, and working with adult learners who have lives and responsibilities that sometimes just take precedence. Thank you for sharing. All right. So talking about test anxiety, and test anxiety is common for everyone in some capacity or another one. Everybody experiences some form of anxiety before and during a test. It's perfectly natural, perfectly understandable. At one point or another, all of us remember at one stage in our life having to take a particular test and being nervous about it's common. And in some circumstances, it can even, when it's not test anxiety, but it's just natural anxiety, sometimes when you experience a little bit of anxiety, it can heighten your performance and you can actually do better. A little bit of anxiety can be a good thing in a testing situation. But, and the main point is the last point that I have here, when it reaches the point where it negatively impacts performance, that's what true test anxiety is. So what causes somebody to experience test anxiety? There's research has shown there's many different reasons. Lack of preparation for a particular test. Students feeling that they didn't prepare. And so cramming has been shown to be a very ineffective tool in preparing for a test. Poor time management. And that can be managing your time when you're taking the test, as well as managing your time to prepare for the test. Sometimes it's a failure to organize text information. Students who love to take notes and review notes, it's a wonderful tool, but sometimes it can be ineffective if the notes aren't organized in such a way that promotes learning. And also sometimes just having poor study habits can be a way to increase a student's anxiety. Also, another thing that happens, and what I find very common with adult learners, they worry about their performance, okay? And they're worried, maybe they've not done well on exams. And so because they've not done well, they worry about how they'll do on this particular test. Some students, if you see a group setting situation, I've had students who were preparing for like the GED, and they go into the testing situation and there's other people who look like they're done before them. And so it makes them think, oh my goodness, what's wrong with me? Why am I doing so poorly? They get anxious because they're like, why are they done so quickly? And what I have found is usually the students that do finish the exams first from having taught at the post-secondary level, I have seen usually my students done first did not do as well as my students who take a little bit more time. But helping students to realize just because they're done early doesn't mean that they've necessarily done well. You know, but students worry because they see other people getting up. Also, the negative consequences of failure. They worry, you know, I'll disappoint my family, I'll disappoint myself, I'll disappoint my teacher if I don't do, you know, as well as I should. So all of those things, whether it's a combination or just one of those things, really is what results in severe test anxiety that impacts performance. And so, you know, what are some physical signs? A lot of the times when you're suffering from test anxiety, you know, you feel it. If you're the student feels it, but sometimes you can also, if you're in the room while the student is doing those assessments, you can see it. You know, you see that they're suffering from it. And so, you know, letting students know if they're suffering from anxiety, some of the things that they may, or maybe students have told you, you know, they're sweating profusely, their palms are sweaty, they talk about having a headache or an upset stomach, their heart's beating faster, they're very tense. So these are all physical manifestations of test anxiety. And also too, when students are really, really nervous about a test, sometimes what happens is they have difficulty reading and understanding questions on the test. So, and that can be particularly true for ESL students when they're nervous because of the process that they go through when they are working through questions that are done in English. Sometimes if a paragraph or an essay is required to be read, they have difficulty organizing their thoughts. They could have difficulty retrieving keywords and concepts that they know. And then some students will do poorly on the test, even though they know the material. I'm sure you've had students who are like, how did I get that wrong? I knew that. It's because they basically went blank, or they just couldn't recall the information. And then as soon as the exam's over, sometimes they're able to remember what happened. So many negative things can happen as a student is experiencing the test anxiety. So how can you help them to reduce some of that? Okay. One of the things that I always like to try to explain to students is what the true purpose of assessment is. Telling them that, you know, if a student says they're nervous about taking a test, you can always share with them that testing can help you to become a better tutor, classroom aide, because the test allows them to identify strengths and weaknesses so that you can plan their time better. It's kind of how I've always approached what the true purpose of assessment is. It's to help me teach you better. And that the exam in no way measures, it's not a measure of intelligence, it's a measure of what I still need to work on with you and what you've already mastered. I also tell students that one of the things that they can do is attend their sessions regularly and practice the skills being introduced when you're with them. So you can provide sample questions, all the assessments that we use, particularly for our educational functioning levels, have sample questions that you can get at the different levels to be able to give students to kind of practice what they're going to look like and give them some introduction to what they can expect to see. I've also used different materials on assessments that is almost like a warm-up exercise for students, where it's like one question that's very similar to what they could expect on an upcoming assessment, whether it's a one of the assessments you're using, such as the CASAS or the TABE, or if it's a practice GED question. So I've used that as almost like a warm-up activity. That way students can more or less practice and see in a non-threatening type of way. They become used to it, so they're not as put off when the time comes for them to actually take the test. And also just reminding students of the successes that they have had when you've done comprehension check questions or a vocabulary review, reminding them that they have had success on different academic tasks can also be very, very helpful as a way to help reduce some of that anxiety. And also, when students are actually sitting down to take the test, I tell them that it's great to choose a place with the fewest distractions. Sometimes if you can take them into a separate room to do the testing, that is always helpful with, minimal people there. And I also always tell students to give themselves an inner pep talk. And what I mean by that is some students get very, very nervous. And so they're like, oh, I'm not smart. I'm not good at this. And just tell them to have an inner pep talk and tell them that they have done well, what they've been working on, that they've done successfully completed homework or assignments and answered questions well. And also I try to let students know to expect a few curveballs when they're testing. And what I mean by that is they are going to come across a question where they do not know the answer, and that it is okay. So many students, and what helps to raise test anxiety, they'll come across a question that they don't know, and that's unfamiliar to them. Then it totally shatters their confidence. Letting them know that they're likely to encounter questions that do that, and that when they see one of those curveball type of questions, come back to it later. Mark it as something to come back to, and make an attempt then. But usually if they can just like say it like, I have no idea on this one, skip it, move on to the next one. The likelihood is if they don't become overwhelmed with coming across a test question that they don't know, they're going to come across other ones that they do know that will help to rebuild that confidence. And then just recognize that they can come back and try their best and answer the question that they're unsure of. Also, there is a very general anxiety control procedure that I have taught students to use, and I've actually seen a couple of them do it. And what it is, it's very basic. It is research-based, very common. You basically tell the students, turn the test paper over, close their eyes, breathe in slowly for the count of 7, and then exhale slowly for the count of 7. And continue the slow breathing till they feel more relaxed. Turn that paper back over again, say, I've got this, give themselves that inner pep talk, and continue with the testing. So it's a very basic, very common anxiety control procedure, but that deep breathing, it's one of the ones that have been shown by research to be one of the most effective. But the idea is that generally tests have enough time built in that you could do this for a minute or two and not impact the timing on the test whatsoever. But this general anxiety of the deep breathing for the count of 7 has been shown to be very successful. And also too, I try to have conversations with students that deal with worrying about running out of time on a test. I tell students, check the time periodically, but try to avoid checking it too frequently, because what happens is when you start to get focused on the time, it just distracts you. It tends to make the students more nervous. And generally what has been found, it's always better to miss a few questions at the end of the test rather than to lose our concentration during and miss a lot of questions. So my recommendation has always been, miss a couple at the end, but, you know, don't focus on the time so much that you start focusing in the middle of the test and maybe you're only a third of the way through. You're better off, you know, just to keep going, remain calm. And if you miss a few at the end because you just didn't get there, that generally you'll score better than if you start to get real nervous in the middle. And also, I have even told students that sometimes you need to think of testing as a type of game where the goal is to collect as many points as possible in the time allotted. And sometimes taking that feeling of pressure off of them by having them think of it as a game, it helps them to feel less pressured while testing, and can help them to do a little bit better. So those are just some general test taking strategies that I have used in the past and that students have indicated to me over the years they have found helpful in helping them to not feel as nervous and pressured while they are taking tests. But there's are some general test taking strategies that might be useful. So I always and I know people are on the fence about this, but I always like to let students know about the type of test that they'll be taking. So whenever students first come in and we tell them they're going to be testing, I always tell them right when I meet them, we're going to be doing more testing in the future. It helps me to see what progress you've made, what areas I still need to work on. But I always put it back on the fact that you know, the testing is more for me than a reflection on them. Also, I always encourage students to attend class a day before a test is being planned. Like if there's a particular date where they're coming, if there's a class before it, a lot of the times doing some type of review with students prior to an assessment can be helpful. If there's additional review or study sessions or additional materials that are online or paper-based that you'd like to give students, encouraging them to do those review type of activities can be helpful. Once again, the sample questions. I always like students to kind of see what it is they're going to be seeing on the test. So I've always tried to provide sample questions. And also I'll remind students that there's no penalty for guessing on most tests. But again, it depends on, you know, your purpose of assessment. If you really don't want them to guess, that's absolutely fine. And you prefer them to leave it blank. But in terms of many other tests that they would take, like if they were taking an employment test, the likelihood there's not going to be a penalty if they would try and guess on that. Also, encouraging students to study their class notes and organize them in a way that works for them whenever they're able to is a great strategy to help them prepare for tests. And also to arranging practice with time readings. If students are really nervous about time tests, and I have had students who get nervous about that, I have had activities where in one part of the session where I've been working with them, we do a time test, so that it gives them practice with doing it. I don't do it every time, but I do it once in a while to help try and relieve some of that nervousness so that they kind of have practice doing it and they're experiencing it where they don't have that what they feel is high stakes pressure. Also encouraging students to predict the types of questions that might be asked on a test. I have done this as an activity with students where we've read a passage and I've said to them occasionally, what do you think, like if you were going to be tested on what we just read, what do you think would be an important question? So we'll talk about things like identifying main idea or the difference between a main idea and a supporting detail, or drawing a conclusion about the passage. So asking students to formulate the questions is sometimes a helpful study strategy for them. Also, always encouraging students that when they are studying to study regularly rather than trying to cram for anything. Research has shown that for information to move from short-term to long-term memory, space practice study is actually the best. And so a study tip that has been around for ages has been 50 minutes of concentrated study with a 10-minute break, and then switching the content area after that 10-minute break is shown to help students retain more information and to be the most effective approach for studying that I have seen in terms of research. And actually, I'll be honest with you, I use it for my own. That's how I study myself, is 50 minutes on and then the 10-minute break, and switching to a different topic. Also too, I've had students who get real nervous and like, it never fails. The very first question they read, they don't know the answer. And so they're done. And sometimes it's just a matter of being a little bit nervous. So I have encouraged students who to go ahead and, like, if they don't know the answer to one, to skip it, go to the next. The likelihood they're going to run into questions that they do know. Answer a few that they do know, then pop back to the ones that they don't know. Those types of things can be very, very helpful and help to relieve some of that anxiety. Also, if students are taking a longer test and they're using a written answer key, encourage them to go back and check and make sure they're on the right line, because there is nothing that is more distressing or distracting to a student to realize that they get to the end of the test and they've gotten off on their numbering. And so now they've missed a question somewhere. And now, particularly if it's a multiple choice test, everything from that question that they missed is wrong. So having them go back and periodically check when they've answered questions, just to make sure that, okay, I'm on question 10. Yes, I'm on question 10 on the answer key. Or I'm on question 2. Wait, I'm on 19. Going back then and having the time to look, it's much easier and saves a lot of time if you can catch it within 10 or maybe even 5 questions, rather than trying to figure it out at the end of a 40 question test. Also, remind students to pay attention and read all the test questions. When I talk a little bit about the different strategies for different types of tests, the importance of making sure that they read the entire question and all the responses is very important. Reminding them to pace themselves so that you don't spend 10 minutes on one single question. That, you know, if you don't know it, you skip it and you move on. And then encourage students, if there's time at the end, to go back and check answers, but not to spend too much time second guessing themselves. Generally, your gut reaction tends to be the correct one. Usually students that go back and forth usually mark an answer that was correct, incorrect, when they start to doubt themselves too much. So now I'm going to go ahead. Has there been any questions or anything so far before I start talking about the different types of test questions? Any questions in the chat box or anything, Rachel?
I don't see anything in the chat.
All righty, we'll go ahead and I'll just keep talking about some different tests here. So true and false questions, okay? For a statement to be true, all parts must be true. So absolute words are words like all, none, ever, where there is no room for exception. That's what we call our absolute words, will tend to make a statement false. There's almost an exception to everything. Qualifier words, however, some, many, most, when you see those, that tends to make a statement true. Also, research has shown that when in doubt about an answer and you really can't narrow it down, it's better to mark it as true. On most true-false tests, there tends to be, and there's always exceptions to the rule, as I said, but for most true or false tests, there tends to be more true answers than false answers, because it's difficult to make a false statement look true. Also, specific details in true-false sentences tend to make the answer true. So George Washington was the first president of the United States. So there tends to be a little bit more detail in there. That tends to make that statement true. However, you have to tell students, and this is what I was talking about when it's important, particularly for true false, to read the question carefully. Generally, to make a statement false, it's easiest to add a false part to a statement that is already true. So George Washington was the first president of the Confederacy. If you read that very quickly and you just see George Washington was the first president, you're going to mark it as true because you know he was the first president. But if you didn't take the time to read that second part, that's how most answers that are false get marked as true. Also, I encourage students to read the statement slowly, sometimes even twice. And students will often see some truth and then make an incorrect assumption that everything's true. So have them read it through. Sometimes if there's enough time to read it through more than once, that is a good thing. Also, many questions that state a reason and one reason only tend to be false. And the reasons more times than not when true false questions asking a reason is because it's incomplete. So for example, the issue of slavery caused the Civil War. That would be false because there were other factors that came into play. So it's incomplete in terms of the question. So those are just my sections for true, false. Sometimes students will see those. Here we have many multiple choice questions that students are required to do. So I have some suggestions for those. You always want to remind the students to read the questions carefully and to use the process of elimination. So that as they're going through and they can mark off questions that they know are not, answers that they know are not correct, marking those off. Also, when you see those absolute words, never, none, as part of a response, those tend to be incorrect. And usually more times than not, the more detailed and conclusive answers tend to be the correct ones. Also, in many instances, research has shown that in multiple choice questions, all the above tends to be more likely of an answer than none of the above. Also, too, when two answers are synonymous, they're pretty much mean exactly the same thing. Both of those can be eliminated. If they're similar, one of them is generally more correct than the other. So, generally, and that more correct generally means it has more detail, and that's what makes it correct. Also, too, when you have numbers as a response, generally more, not all the time, as I said, but more times than not, having students choose from the middle ranges rather than the extremes. The middle range is one of the middle ranges tend to be the answer. The extremes are meant to be distractors. So those are just some basic suggestions for your multiple choice type of test. Now, if you have matching, some tests have the same number of items in both columns, okay, which tends to be the easiest type of matching test. However, there are matching tests that have more answers than terms. Those tend to be more challenging. So helping students to be prepared for both of those is helpful. Telling students to review both lists prior to making their answer choice can be very helpful because it can help you to determine the term and its relationship. Also, going through the list at least one time before you start answering can help students to feel more confident because they're likely to enhance their memory as they're reading through those lists. And I always tell students, start with one list as your starting point, and then you go through the second list to find the match. Don't bounce back and forth. As you go through and you're looking through and you stick to the process, one list with the answer, looking through those answers each time, it'll help to improve your memory and recall as you're seeing them over and over again. Also, I tell students, make sure you read through the entire list before you start making your choices, because a more correct answer could follow depending upon the type of test that it is. And also telling students, once they make a final choice, scratching it off the list can make it easier as you're looking for future choices. And I always tell students, don't start guessing until you do all your absolute choices on a matching test. So once you're absolutely sure of an answer, get all of those out of the way, then you go back to the ones you're not sure of, because it's possible that as you made your absolute matches, you eliminated some of your choices that you weren't sure about. So those are just some basic suggestions for different types of matching tests. For short answer tests, where students are asked to do short answer, one of the things that I tell students, make sure you read the questions very carefully. And also to check point distributions, because some short answer questions may be worth more points than others, depending upon the type of test that it is. Also telling students to take the time to formulate their answer before writing or speaking. That little bit of pause is not a bad thing, and it can be very helpful. Also, I tell students when they are doing short answer, if it's something that requires complete sentences, to give their best effort to their composition, spelling, do their best there. And if you come across a short answer question, because sometimes tests are set up in such a way that they ask different types of questions. So you may have some matching, some true, false, some multiple choice. So sometimes if you go back through the test, if you're not sure of an answer, you can get some clues to what the question may be about, or what they might be looking for, looking at some of the previous answers on the test. Now, when it comes to essay type questions, there are a few suggestions I have for those as well. First of all, telling people to outline ideas before they start writing can be very helpful. So, so many students want to start writing, but sometimes and we teach this when we teach writing for the GED all the time, outline what it is that you want to say. Also, reminding them not to ramble is an important thing, that just writing for writing's sake is not a good idea on an essay test. Also, too, reminding them to stick to the questions that are being asked, to try and avoid going off on tangents when they write, to keep the writing focused, and giving them activities and practice doing that can be very helpful. And I have told students, like, if it's a two-part question, but you only know the answer to one part of it, develop that one part very well and do your best with the other. Because sometimes a partial answer can at least demonstrate what you do or do not know. And then always with essay, I tell students to use their best writing skills. So using correct grammar, spelling, composition, punctuation, mechanics, all of those things. Encouraging students, if it's possible, to leave a little bit of time at the end of the test in order to be able to proofread is always a good idea. Encourage them to paraphrase the question to form their introductory statement. I tend to teach students to do that, to how to rephrase the question so in such a way so that then they can help to formulate their response. This is something when I teach writing to do all the time, because by having them do that, what I found, it allows me to make sure that they understand what it is that's being asked in the question. And then reminding them that when they're writing, that they should be including a main idea, supporting details, examples, all those things that are important for writing. So we do some practice with essay writing to make sure they master those skills. And then I tell students to identify words or verbs in the question that give them direction. Encourage them to circle the words and make sure they're completing the desired task. So we have direction verbs and adjectives, like direction verbs that ask for a set of items. They're generally looking for like steps. So when they see words like trace, outline, list, and the words that I have listed there indicates that they want an organization in a particular list of things. If they're asking students to speak in favor or against something, they're using words like defend, justify. If they're asking them for a specific meaning of a concept, they might be asking them to define, clarify, describe, illustrate. So I do teach these different words to students so that they understand what it is that they're asking for. And to show differences in ideas or situations are words like contrast, distinguish, differentiate if we're working with some higher level students. And then for it, you know, helping them to identify when there's a point that they consider being very important that they want to address, like recognizing words like key, critical, major, vital. Those types of words are very, very important when we're talking about essay writing, so that students recognize these words and what the task is that they're being asked to complete in their writing. And then one of the most important things I think that a lot of students forget to do, that I think is really, really important to do, is to assess the errors that were made after a test. So encouraging students to look at like the types of errors that were made. And even if they're not allowed, like you can't show them, you know, the test question that they missed. But you know, if it's one of our standardized tests that we use, but you can tell them, okay, it looks like you missed 3 supporting detail questions. So we talk about, you know, identifying what the supporting detail is. And if it is a test where we can kind of show that where they did the assessment and go back, being able to show them what they missed and kind of working through that process. And asking students to identify, well, what made you choose this answer? I've done that with students where I'm like, okay, so we see the answer C, but you picked B. What made you pick B? And a lot of times I'll say it was between B and C. I thought B was the better response for, or whatever, but then talking about, okay, can we see why C was the correct, and going through that. Also just making sure that students didn't lose points because they skipped over something. Or they thought they answered it and they didn't. And then also encouraging students to talk with you to help them figure out what they missed and how to do better. You know, encouraging them to talk about those things can be very, very important. So, you know, just getting them to understand that missing questions is okay and it can help us to help you, I think is something that's very, very important. And it helps students not feel as intimidated by assessments. So I like to remind students that in terms of test taking, everybody can become a more effective test taker. Some of us are better at taking tests than others, but there are strategies that can help students to improve performance on testing, and also helping students to recognize that improving test taking skills in any capacity can really help them meet their goals. So I know that I talked a lot today. I hopefully gave you a lot of information, but does anybody have any questions for me? Or any comments or anything in terms of test taking? Maybe something you didn't know that we went over today?
Angela, I just wanted to say that I really like the point that test taking is sort of a skill, and that it's something that students can get better at, you know, and just like anything else, you can practice it and you can get better. Oh, Sumalata says, can we add a reward?
Absolutely. Rewards are a great tool for students. usually, and it all depends upon that student's motivation. So if their motivation tends to be extrinsic more than intrinsic, and that reward will work, absolutely.
You just want to do it in a way that it doesn't add another layer of stress.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the rewards usually it's like, ooh, here's a highlighter for you.
Yeah. And Christine asked if we'll get the recording even though you were in the live webinar. You can always, in fact, that's a good reminder. I'm going to repost the link to the recordings. The recordings usually get posted on the website after about a week. If you go to check after a week and the recording is not up, please let me know, and I'll hassle Matt for you. And also just a reminder that we have the survey. So if you want to complete the survey, that's always useful for us and for our presenters. And anything else? Okay. Our next webinar will be June 13, and that one will be on pronunciation. So if you're working with English language learners, that will be a useful one for you. So if you don't have any more questions, thank you so much, Angela. This was a lot of information
Yes.
and very useful.
Thank you.